Probably the last fall 2020 sociological theory lectures post-coronavirus. This is a skeleton key to Jacques Lacan's seminar on the Purloined Letter. It's an odd text, but I still think I've tried it a couple of times, I still think it's the best sort of entry point into Lacan's work. It's the first chapter in the Krier, and the version of this I recommend students get is just Bruce Fink's 2006 translation. It's so much better than what came before, and again, it is the first chapter in it. There are other versions online that you can get for free, but I really do strongly recommend getting Fink's translation, which I've been through many times. Let's see. So the seminar on the Purloined Letter was delivered, I believe, in 1955, and then it went through a couple of additions, I think, that were added to it, something approximating an appendix, before it reached sort of its final form in 66, translated into English at various moments afterwards, and then Fink's 2006 translation is sort of the I would say the gold standard here. I think the reason it's accessible is that it's based on a story, and it's actually a kind of, I don't know, a riff really on one of Edgar Allan Poe's most readable, interesting short stories, one called The Purloined Letter. So the Purloined Letter is the third in a series of stories featuring Auguste Dupin, the Chevalier Auguste Dupin, who is really our first great fictional detective, and this is the third, detective fiction story ever written. So if you're into Sherlock Holmes and so on, this is really where it all begins. So like Sherlock Holmes and like so many fictional detectives, the Chevalier Dupin is an amateur. Described as kind of, a true kind of lethargic man. I mean, he's not really a man of action or a man of fighting and brawn or something, but more of a thinker, kind of a recluse, poor, even relatively poor. And this story opens with Dupin and his and a friend of his who is unnamed, the narrator, sitting around smoking for an hour and puffing away on their pipes, and they're interrupted by a police prefect who's acquainted with Dupin, and that this then launches the story. And why don't we sort of get inside of the story first, and then we'll move along. So that's, I mean, you can come back to this. So in the story, so the men are sitting around smoking a pipe, silently, and kind of in almost like a psychoanalytic position, laying back, silently smoking. And in the era of cell phones, this wouldn't happen very much. And so the police prefect intervenes and says, "I've got a simple but odd case for you." And what it is that there is a we'll just jump right into where Lacan takes it. Lacan believes this is a queen, and that a queen has had one of her letters stolen, and it's a compromising letter. Probably, I mean, Lacan just goes right there. It's almost certainly a sexual intrigue that she's involved in, a sexual affair that she's involved in, and that her husband, the king, doesn't know about this, and that the letter lays upon the queenly boudoir, the bed, I believe, and that the king is in her compartment, and a minister who's a bit of a demon comes in and spies the letter, that is in the hand of the queen, and the queen tries to hide it, just lays it on the bed, doesn't try to draw attention to it, but the minister realizes what it is, grabs it, kind of a complicated maneuver, and then apparently proceeds to blackmail the queen, or at least is planning to blackmail or extort the queen in some way using the content of this letter, at least using the letter. But quite a bit of time goes by. The queen eventually goes to the police and asks the police to find it. The prefect is involved. There's an account of all of the elaborate pokings and proddings and waylaying the man and everything else to try to recover the physical letter, which doesn't happen. And then the prefect comes and sort of lays this problem before Dupin, and says, look, I've looked everywhere, I can't find the thing. And Dupin sort of says, well, too bad. But about a month later, the prefect comes back, and in the interim, Dupin has actually found the letter and gets a check for $50,000 and gives it to the prefect of police. And I suppose that his plan will be to return it to the Queen. Hard to know. But tragedy or scandal was avoided here, and so the whole thing then revolves around where was the purloined letter. So purloined is a sort of fancy term for stolen, but as we're going to find out, it has a very unique meaning here. So so the letter then was stolen, right? So the letter, as Lacan says, is kind of a portal between two incompatible worlds, that there are basically two different readings of who the Queen is and the symbolic position that the Queen occupies. If she is Queen, she can't be involved in extramarital affairs, because essentially the legitimacy of the line of succession depends upon her body, and that therefore this letter, if it really does reveal a sexual affair, again, we never actually know for certain that that's the case, but if it does, it certainly puts her life at danger, and it certainly delegitimates the king and so on. So it's a serious matter here. So that letter, again, is kind of like a portal, that the Queen's position as Queen depends upon whatever that letter reveals being suppressed, and even the letter itself being suppressed, right? That she can't both simultaneously be Queen and be known to possess that letter. Okay, so the letter is stolen by the minister with the king absolutely present, and actually the king seeing and observing the letter itself. He doesn't really pay attention to it. He doesn't really notice what it is. So the king is an innocent third. He's like the big other who is present but doesn't see. So he doesn't see what goes on. So the queen, whose hands are then tied, she can't stop the minister from taking the letter, even though it's right in plain sight, because if she does, if she draws attention to it, then the king will know, right? So the robbery takes place in plain sight, right in front of the king, who doesn't realize that the robbery's taking place. The queen knows she's having a theft, but she can't stop it because she would draw attention to the king, which would then set in the chain of consequences that would befall her. So she doesn't do it. All right, so the prefect of police is called. They search everywhere. There's these elaborate discussions of looking for secret doors and cushions, hollow cavities in furniture, looking behind mirrors and behind, like even pulling up like floorboards and, lifting bricks out of the yard out front and taking the moss away. And, they do a pretty thorough search. The argument is that it has to be in the house. It isn't on his person, so the minister has it stored somewhere. But they can't find the thing despite searching in an exhaustive way to try to locate the physical letter itself. They have a description, they know what it looks like, but they can't find it. All right. So they actually go so far as to divide the house into geometric spaces, and then they search each of those geometric spaces sort of exhaustively, and they still can't find the thing. They create a grid, they can't get it. Okay, so after the prefect of police leaves, the next moment is a month later, and he returns, and Dupin essentially exchanges the letter for money. I think he gets 50,000 francs or something like that. And then you get this description that takes place of how he went about doing it, what his strategy was, and so on. Now, crucial to this was a description of something called the game of even odd. So it's really sort of like a game of, marbles or something like that, like schoolboys would play. And as he's describing, so the game of even and odd is, in my version, is described on page 191. So let's take a moment to read this. I'll try to draw it in and get it clear for you here. Okay, so much of the text revolves around this account, this story. So, so there is a, many a schoolboy is a better reasoner than the prefect of police was. This is Dupin after he found the stolen letter, the purloined letter. And he says, I knew a boy about 8 years of age whose success at guessing in the game of even and odd attracted universal admiration. This game is simple. Played with marbles. One player holds in his hand a number of marbles and demands of another whether it's an even number of these or an odd number. If you get it right, you get the marble. If you don't, you don't. And this boy wound up having won all the marbles in the school, right? And so he had a principle of guessing. And what he would do is that he said that he would simply mimic. So he would try to identify with his opponent, and he would do it by adopting he would mimic the facial expression. When I wish to find out how wise or how stupid or how good or how wicked is anyone, or what are his thoughts at the moment, I fashion the expression of my face as accurately as possible in accordance with the expression of his, and then wait to see what thoughts or sentiments arise in my mind or heart, as if to match or correspond with the expression. So this is an imaginary identification, a mirror. So in essence, that's really what happens, right? So in order to figure out what's going on in the mind, you engage in a kind of a mirroring, an identification, an imaginary identification, and then that is supposed to give you the secret of the reasoning. So this is what Dupin sells to his friend as his mode of sort of figuring out where the minister had secreted the letter. It was to imagine him. He knows who he was, and he imagined, with this kind of identification, how it worked. Now, Lacan is going to say that this is silly and it doesn't work that way. And what he's going to, so in other words, he's going to say that we're not determined by our imaginary identifications. We're not determined by two-person intersubjectivity or by something like relationships with significant others as such. Instead, like all great sort of structural sociologists, Lacan argues that we are determined by the structural order in which we're embedded, and in particular, he argues we are determined, right? We are subjects of the signifying chain in which the significant symbols that govern our life are embedded. Okay, so we are the subjects of signifiers. So in that sense, this is sort of the beginning of where Lacan goes. So Lacan is going to argue that however Dupin figured out where the letter was, it wasn't by adopting mimicking the face and expressions of his opponent. It wasn't through the imaginary. And it wasn't done by poking and prodding and exhaustively searching in the real world for the physical letter in the physical apartment on the physical person of the minister. Instead, he argues, the way that we have to figure out where the letter was and to figure out how action was determined was to view the letter as a symbolic thing and as a sign, as a signifier, and then trace it from there. Okay? All right. So I think that gets us where we need to go. So, of course, the trick to the whole thing is he finds out, of course, that the minister concealed the letter not by concealing it; he concealed it in open sight. And he talks about another parlor game that was played where you would get a map, a large map, and then people would be challenged to find on the map some word that was located on the map. And he claimed that the trick to playing the game wouldn't be to choose the smallest little word for a town or something, but instead was to choose a word for a big region or for a big territory that sprawled across the page. And it was by its very obviousness, right? The fact that it was so obvious, that it was so conspicuous, actually helped to conceal it, right? And so that was his art. That was his thinking, is that this guy was subtle enough to know this and that he would secrete the letter in plain sight. And so that's what he did. He went to his apartment and looked for it in plain sight. He wore green eye shades, and then so that the minister couldn't see where his eyes were looking. Searched around everywhere, and then found that the letter was again hidden in plain sight, and was right there. So yeah, okay. So I think that's where it goes. So that's basically your story. So there's a letter that gets stolen, purloined, right? And then there's several searches for it, and ultimately the letter winds up getting returned to the police, and then we don't see it in the story, but probably returned to somebody else, to the original possessor of the letter on the other side. Okay. So that's the story. So that's where this thing starts. And by the way, this is basically Lacan's project, is to make an argument throughout his work about the power and structuration, the structuring of human beings by the symbolic order. So this comes from Freud, and it's certainly coming from Durkheim, and it's coming from other people. He's a French social thinker. Lévi-Strauss, Claude Lévi-Strauss, is attending some of his seminars and works in some sort of collaboration with him at times. So this is a structural sociological framing of the determination of conduct. And this seems like an odd place for a psychoanalyst to dwell and to sort of develop a lifetime project, but that's where he went, right? And his argument is that that's actually where Freud was too. All right, so let's very briefly talk about what the three regions are. So this is sort of one of the drawings of the famous Lacanian Triad, the ISR Triad, imaginary, symbolic, and real triad. So what Lacan argues is that humans are that what we take as reality is some combination of the real, which is defined basically as, he says, the thing which is always in its place. It's sort of the physical world that's not determined by subjectivity. It's not determined by human action as such. It's really a and even that's the wrong way to put it. It's the thing that's left over when the other two are there. So the body is generally included in the real, even though the body is always overwritten with signifiers and imagination. But bodies, nature itself, again, physical pulsations, the way that the universe works, heat, light, gravity, those kinds of things. It's all part of the real. So I have it written down here as organs, nature, drives are all part of the real. Our organic drives. Okay, so why don't I just go ahead and use like my the picture that I often deploy when I'm teaching Lacan. Yeah. So we'll just kind of walk it through it first. So this is a minor transformation of the L schema, he calls it, which is located at the end of the seminar on the Purloined Letter. So in the Krier version I have, it's on page 40. So that's the L schema. So this is sort of a slightly simplified version of that I use for teaching purposes. But basically, human beings, so as humans mature, as we go through the maturational process, we develop through the real into the imaginary, and then finally we're installed in the symbolic about the time that, I would say we go to school, or that we suffer castration in Freud's terms, or that we go through the Oedipal complex in Freud's terms. We don't really need to embed ourselves in that at the moment, but the idea is that we're born or as an organic organ sac, held together by skin and full of organic drives, and that our drives compel us out into the world. Our mothers are there, our motherers are there, and we interact in a real way with the mother. So by real action, we are subjects of our drives. We're subject to our drives, hunger, thirst, and need to be cleaned, and that kind of thing. Comfort, the regulation of temperature, stimulation, those kind of things. That the mother is the source of that. So at this level, this is something like the interaction in the real, and as Lacan says, is in the process of interacting with mothers, with mothers, breastfeeding, caring, providing touch and so on, that the mother also feeds words, and that the child develops a sense of itself, an ego, a sense of self and I in something called the mirror stage, which occurs at the moment when the reflective surface of the mother helps the child to identify with itself out there and see that it is a being separate from this more or less coherent other known as the mother-er. So that's the mirror stage. So the ego, so the A is the mirror stage is the subject interacting with the other, and the French term for that is Autre, I think. I'm sorry, I'll just make it. My French is non-existent. So so it's small other. Small other is the French word for other. So it's the small other, and then so that's the A, and then the A prime down here is the ego or the self or the eek. I've taught this several times over the course of this semester. So you're born as the subject of organic drives, and you live in the real. But again, it doesn't take long, like 4 or 5 months really, and you begin to become the desire. You become the subject of the desire of the other, right? You begin to interact in an imaginary way with this other, and that this becomes. So this is the imaginary relation. So in the short story we just talked about with the Dupin talking about this 8-year-old boy who would mirror the facial expressions of another boy to figure out if they were any good at playing even and odd, that was at that mirror stage, right? That you're looking into the face of another and you're interacting with each other at an imaginary level. I am looking at myself, I am seeing myself as reflected off of the other. Who does the other think I am? That's who I am. They are looking in my face, I know that, so they are who I think I am, they are with me, and that we have this kind of this mutual definition that's relatively idiosyncratic to the two of us. That's it. And of course Lacan and any sociologist will tell you that that's not a very complete story, and that at somewhere along the line we wind up installed in what is called a big other, and the big other, big A, big A, the big other is the agency of what he calls the paternal function, the name of the father, the God, possibly, the entire structural system of language and law, language especially, so we'll just put that in here, language and law, both of which are invoked in Lacan's analysis here. And so this is, when you get to this point, you're no longer looking into an actual person's face. Even if you look into the face of the father, or look into the face of a policeman, or looking into the face of a judge, you're not, or a priest, you're not really looking into the symbolic order. The symbolic order is bigger than, it's spiritual, it's symbolic, it's a chain of significations. It doesn't exist in the real. It exists again in that sublime region that only human beings create, right? It's a sublime thing. So it's purely abstract and so on. And so even if we have a father, the father is looking into the father's face is an imaginary thing. The father is a representative of the paternal function, which is language and law, telling us how to speak, how to behave, how to be ethical, and so on. Okay. So somewhere here, so this again will put this age, say, 1 to 2. You'll never drop out of the real. I'm hungry right now myself, so I haven't dropped out of the real. So I'll be eating shortly, so I'm still in the real. And then about let's say 6 months to say 6 years, the dominant is the mirror stage. Maybe that's a little too old. And then we'll say from 5 years old on, you become a subject of the symbolic order. Okay, so those are our 3 regions. We've got the real of the organs that you're born into. You have the imaginary, again, which sort of lives in the imagination. It's the world of fantasy and image and totems and visual representation. It primarily affects us through the eye, although the ear is also invoked. And then we eventually become part of the symbolic order, language and law, right? That doesn't exist in an effective way in the real, right? You can write a letter, and the letter is physical, but that isn't really what the letter is. The message of the letter is something that's purely symbolic, right? Okay. So I think that gives us the basis. So this is the Lacanian Triad. These are the 3 regions that Lacan writes about. Okay, so Lacan's work, the basic work, is to theorize, as he thought Freud did, this problematic. The person who is subject to the symbolic order, the person who is subject to symbols, to signification, and so on, and what does that mean then for the human subject? Okay. And so, Freud's psychoanalytic technique lays patients on a couch and has them talk about the relationship with their mother and other immediate immediate people in their life. But ultimately, what Freud is trying to get to is the concept of guilt and trying to understand how individuals have been wounded or traumatized or structured by, or determined or overridden or overmastered by this symbolic order, right? So, as a sociologist, much of the symbolic order includes positions within a contractual order, or even informal positions outside of contracts that nevertheless are binding upon the individual. I'm a father. I have a daughter right here near me. I'm a husband. I'm a son. That these aren't contractual obligations, but they bear down upon me, and they are symbolically and structurally linked. And ultimately, even my relationship as a father, for example, will in the last instance be hooked back up into language and law, right? And so the symbolic order bears down upon me through all of the duties that I perform and all of the relationships that I'm in. Okay, so how does a human being coming into the world as a baby come into possession of law and language? Or in other words, how do they become determined by law and language? How does this happen? Well, Lacan, Freud, both were very interested in this. I read a lot of sort of latter-day psychoanalysts, second and third generation analysts, who really became, the focus of their work was like infant and early childhood analysis. So this is Margaret Mahler's book on symbiosis and individuation. I'll just say that it isn't an easy process for us to come into possession of language and to understand what language means and to begin to structure experience using discourse and using concepts and ideas. Good and bad are very hard. Right and wrong are very hard, right? And even to make the connection, as Lacan tries to encourage us to comprehend the connection between the body and the imagination and concepts, right? The structural world of language and law. Hard to do. So on page 83 of Mahler's book is a discussion. I won't read it in detail or anything, but it's just one example. This book is really all about children who are going through these phases of development where they begin to separate and individuate themselves, separate from their mother or for the mother-ers. And one of those moments of separation, of course, involves gaining controls of the excretory functions. And so, toilet training and so on is always involved in this. As we all know, anybody who has even a nodding acquaintance with psychoanalysis knows that these things are invoked, right? And so there's a description here of a little girl whose mother is pregnant, and the girl develops because the mother's belly is swelling, she begins to imagine that and identifies with the mother in some way, and doesn't won't. She begins being difficult, whining, and demanding, and she hasn't had a bowel movement for several days. And when they ask about it, she says, "I can't do it," and she begins to think about, she talks about her mommy and her daddy both having piggies inside of them, and she begins equating feces with babies in all kinds of interesting ways. And then she begins, cleaning really obsessively about cleaning. And when she gets a pain from not having used, the bathroom for a while, she attributes that pain to her mother, like her mother is causing the pain, right? So this is a little girl about 24 months old, right? And 29 months old. And then when she finally gets the relief of completing the excretory function, then she sort of is happy, and she attributes it, to her mother. And it's what's inside. I just love some of this stuff. So what's inside the mother's tummy? It's she thinks her dad's heavy. He's going to have a piggy. Her mommy's got a baby horse inside of her, not a baby person. So it's really remarkable to read like Mahler or other of these analysts who are really carefully documenting what happens to children as they begin to master their organic, their real drives and so on, and they become into possession of an image of themselves vis-a-vis a mother, and they're trying to understand concepts and words and meanings and right and wrong and morality and duty and those kinds of things. And it's, kids are crazy. We're all crazy underneath at some level. Okay, and that's sort of what Lacan is trying to understand. Like, okay, so how do we go through this process, pulling ourselves together as an individual, and then wind up installed in some kind of symbolic order of language and law, anchored often by a paternal figure of some kind, what he calls the name of the father. Again, not an actual father, but a name, a mere name, and so on. Okay, so that's sort of his project, is to understand how we human beings are overridden, overmastered, penetrated, cut deeply into by the structure of this symbolic order. Okay? All right. So that's Lacan. I think then let's just jump into, I've got one more image. I wasn't going to show this. This is, I over the years I just drew little sketches to try to sort of comprehend Lacan, but if you can keep something like a triad structure in mind, a triune structure, and so, and in a weird kind of, well, we're going to leave that out. But so we have down here kind of the organic world of material bodies and nature and so on. That, the material world that's complete in and of itself, that doesn't require symbolization, that doesn't require imagination. It's there, right? It's the woods with bears in it, and trees fall, and the bear does its business, whether we're there or not to see it, whether we're there to conceptualize it or talking about it, right? It's the world. This is the real, okay? All right. So underneath existence, the baseline of existence is the real, and then on top of that, we get it kind of an imaginary, right, that emerges through the mirror function and so on. So this is sort of the world of images and art, and I've got fantasy structures here, like little surrealist images and so on. And again, this is the realm that dominates humans from, again, like the age of 6 months through the age of, say, 5 or 6. It never goes away. It's always there. Interpersonal relationships are often dominated by this. The content of dreams is often dominated by this. Fantasies are dominated by it, right? So the texture of everyday life is often imaginary, right? Okay, but then on top of that, or through that, we're actually embedded within structures of language. I got language going that direction and law going that direction, right? And that in the end, I don't have it really penetrating as well as I would like, but that the imaginary and the real are structured by the symbolic, okay? And that's what I'm trying to get at here, is this triune structure. So language and law structured like linguists would do, right? With antonyms and synonyms, with the diachronic flow of words in sentences put together into messages, right? Versus the synchronic relationship of words, again, structured as antonyms and synonyms, the parts of speech and so on, right? Semantics and syntax. And so we're embedded in this, and that this structure, again, the world of language and law structures us, cuts down through our imaginary, determines our imaginary, cuts right down into our real, and determines the meaning and process of the real. Okay, so many of Freud's early patients were people who had psychosomatic illnesses, right? That something had happened, and that the symptom that they manifested actually showed itself in the form of physical pains or physical symptoms. And so even the real, Freud learned, was being structured by the symbolic order. So that was Freud, and that's Lacan. So Lacan is, again, really interested in the structuring of the individual. I'm just going to show another image just to kind of help get this through. This is sort of this is sort of my image of castration from a few years back. I've used this for teaching. And that this is sort of an image of what castration would be. You're self-contained and self-complete as an imaginary being living in a world of imagine, right? So like little boys, little girls, 4 or 5 years old, perfectly happy at home. They've got their toys, they got their mommy, they're good to go. And then at some point they're taken away and they're jammed inside of a structural system of language and law, schools. And at that point, you can't take it all with you, right? And so you have to leave something behind. And the thing that you leave behind, which I have shown here at the moment that it's being cut off, the excess, is the immediate access to embodied pleasures and the immediate access to the imaginary relationship that you had with, say, your mother or with those there. And so so the moment of that installation of the symbolic order, a part of you is cut off. Now, the way that Freud writes about it, Lacan also, is that it's that there's a loss of something. It isn't actually physical, but it's imagined in the fantasy world often as a physical thing. But at any rate, you have to give something up. You give up your jouissance, you give up your enjoyment, your immediate enjoyment, immediate access to enjoyment. So once you're installed within in a symbolic order, wherever you're installed, wherever your position is, in school or as a lawyer or as a factory worker, wherever your position is, you then are going to see the world, your worldview, the imaginary itself is going to be structured by that. And the traumas that you went through during that installation process are going to be determinant of your subjectivity for the rest of your life, right? Or at least until you go through therapy, something along those lines. So for Lacan, again, like, he's really interested in the way that the symbolic order of language and law structures the human subject, not just in a developmental way, but really throughout life. Okay. All right. Back to the Purloined Letter. Okay. So what is the purpose of the Purloined Letter? Why would you want to study that or begin with that? All right, so he says that, look, he's interested in what's called repetition compulsion. Now, the Fink translation uses automatism, but generally we talk about repetition compulsion. We're not analysts; we don't need to worry about that word too much. But the compulsion to repeat, and what Lacan tells us, following Freud, is that when we repeat things, it isn't mere memory. We're not, at least. There's a form of repetition that's coming very deep. It's the return of the repressed, right? It's a repetition compulsion. And that this isn't coming because of memory. It isn't like we're remembering to do something and then doing it. We can't remember why we're doing it, right? We're repeating something that is, and we have really often no idea why we're doing it. It's often ego dystonic. It means it's not helping us in some way. And we do it over and over again, and we can't quite figure it out, right? Why do we do this thing? And that's one of the things that Lacan is trying to theorize, and as was Freud. And the argument that Lacan begins with then is that this is due to the insistence of the signifying chain, the signifier, versus the existence of either the eccentric place of the subject of the unconscious. So his argument is that we repeat things because we have because there's something out of place. We have something that is speaking, right? That's telling us to act in a way. We're acting, but we can't quite comprehend why or how. We can't verbally explain why, right? So it's coming from the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious, and again the famous phrase from Lacan is that the unconscious is structured like a language, right? It's structured like a language. It comes up all over the Krier. Okay, so he's interested in what he calls the oblique imaginary means that the symbolic takes hold in the deepest recesses of the human organism. So what that means, again, is our fantasy life, the way we make sense of things, like the little girl who was trying to make sense of the pain that she was feeling as she hasn't defecated for a couple of days, right? She's trying to make sense of it. And the way that she imagines it, it's actually her mother that's causing the pain. Her mother's going to give birth to a horse, right? There's all these things going on. And so that's the imaginary. That's the fantasy that's going around. But his argument is going to be that when you're repeating things, it's due to that somewhere deep within the organism, the symbolic structure has taken hold. That has generated something like imaginary effects that give us nothing... fantasy, right? Imaginary effects, but that give us nothing of any consistency unless they are related to the symbolic chain that binds them and orients them, right? And So that there's a law specific to this chain. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. So let's hit here. So in probably the most important return to Freud. So when Lacan was encouraging his the members of his seminar to return to Freud. Of course, I'm going to not be able to find the bloody thing now, which is usual. But he yeah, there it is, the word kettle. Yeah. The most important book, the first one that Freud wrote, that dealt with just this thing, the imaginary effects that are structured by the symbolic order and that bind them together to make sense of them, right, and orient them. And this came about from the interpretation of dreams. And I'm using the old Britannia Great Books version of Freud. I just have so many notes in it. I've kept using it over the years. But in my version, it's on page 182. It's where he finally, after sort of clearing the ground of other people's writings and thinking about dreams, he lays out his first great dream interpretation. And he dreamed it. He has the date down. He dreamed this dream on the night of July 23rd, or maybe the early morning of July 24th, 1895. And he writes his friend Fleisch and says that Alan Fleisch that at some point there's going to be a plaque on the house where he was staying that says that this is where Sigmund Freud discovered the truth of dreams or something. And I don't know. I don't know if the house exists or if there's a plaque there. Been several wars, who knows? But anyway, this is the famous dream of Irma's injection. So he has a dream about this young woman. The young woman turns out to be a patient of his, and it's not going well. The treatment has only been partially successful. She's a family friend, and so things aren't. He's really feeling bad about the way that her treatment's going. He's just written up kind of like a review of her case or something. And anyway, so she's having trouble. She comes, she looks pale and puffy. She asks her to having trouble with throat sickness in the throat, and he looks down in her throat, and there's all these curled formation, grayish-white scabs, curious, shaped like the terminal bones of the nose, right? He's got this mucus and things that are coming out of it. And anyway, there's all kinds of little details that come out. It's only a paragraph long, the dream is. But the analysis of that dream took him some time to do. And what he did is he basically broke down the dream into each of its little elements, right? The pieces of the dream, and then he analyzed each of those. So what do each of those little elements of the dream mean to me? So he claimed that the dream was a rebus, that ideas that he'd had been translated into imagery, and so the imagery was like the imagery of the grotesque fantasy formations that existed in her throat and so on. That's the imagery, and that what the analysis does is you take each of those elements, you treat them not as a universal symbol, but you probe what the meaning of each one of those elements is through a process of free association, and then you reconstruct essentially the sentence of the dream, and each one of the dream elements, the images, wind up becoming a word. So it's like I love New York, right? We get the I and the love and New York. That each one of those images gets replaced with a word. The word forms a sentence, and that's it. So the analysis of that dream takes quite a few pages, and he says that's the first one he ever did. Okay, so again, Freud was interested in that. So it turns out he had this dream because he was failing as a doctor. He felt bad about it, right, and he wanted someone else to take the blame, which is partly why he was coming up with physical symptoms for her so that he wasn't at fault. Okay, so there it is. That there's imaginary effects, the dream, that can only be made consistent when it's related back to a symbolic chain, a chain of signifiers related to, to the meaning that these words and duties and so on have, that binds them and orients them. So you have to analyze the content of the dream that way. Okay. All right, so there's a law specific to this chain which governs the psychoanalytic effects that are determinate for the subject. And then he specifies three recurring effects, and he claims that they're negations, basically. It's actually kind of a mess here. So there are three that he uses in his mature writing. I'll just point to all three of them right here. So all three are forms of negations or Verneinung. My German pronunciation is bad tonight. We'll just let it go. But one of them is foreclosure, which is typical of psychotics. This is where the interaction with the signifier leads you to just simply foreclose. You don't really pay attention to. You simply ignore. There's more to it than that. Repression and disavowal. I think I'm going to stop here and maybe start a second tape.